Hey comrades, welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're back with part 2 of our excellent theoretically dense exploration of Jean Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death from 1976 with Comrade Cooper Cherry, or Triple C, from Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. Picking up from part 1, we're going to talk a lot more about fashion. We're going to talk about reproduction, the hyperreal. We're going to talk about literal excrement and how it relates to death, exchange, symbolic exchange, poetry, the Gulf War, and do some final wrap-up as well. We're just going to jump right in today, since hopefully you have already listened to part 1, you kind of know the deal, and just want to get right into the meat. But before we do that, as always, let's run down the different ways to support Red Library. If you are a fan of the show, you're one of our comrade listeners, and want to just keep supporting the work that we're doing week in and week out. If you'd like to become a patron and get access to exclusive episodes, usually one a month, our Discord server, our movie nights, and all sorts of other good stuff, head over to Patreon. You can find a link in the show notes, and for as little as $1 a month, or roughly a quarter an episode, you can get access to all that exclusive content. We recently hit our goal of 50 patrons, and now we're going to work up to 100 and just keep building the show's resources so we can buy new equipment, buy new books, find other cool ways to put that money back into the show to expand what we're offering to you, our Comrade Patron listeners across the globe. Remember, if you're listening on iTunes, go down, like, subscribe, give us one of those star reviews, maybe write us a line or two, as that helps new listeners find the show, gets us into more and more people's suggested podcasts that listen to a lot of other shows, kind of in the same ballpark as what we do at Red Library. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and in general, just keep sharing the show around, as we are just always trying to build our listener base. Please remember that Red Library, along with The Regrettable Century and From 78, now make up the Lost Horizons podcasting network. You can find a link down to our webpage. Remember, we have our own roundtable discussion podcast that you can find on any one of your podcast catchers, so remember to keep supporting not just our work, but our collective work as a podcasting network. Without further ado, here we go, me and Triple C finishing out Jean Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death. We'll see you back here afterward.
Baudrillard also kind of applies that same model, I think. He mentions in the book, it's like opinion polls and how they have sort of this self-referential element to them because there's no actual real to which they're kind of corresponding. They're simply like people see the opinions, and like people's opinions are shaped by the opinion polls, and vice versa. And it's this weird, kind of closed system in itself. But I think that's kind of exemplified too in the example of the Supreme Brick, about that kind of weird like use value element of it, or how these things come, like the symbolic or simulacrum of it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good example too.
This kind of is neither here nor there, but Baudrillard as well in this chapter mentions what I think is interesting is he's obsessed with the Twin Towers, like the World Trade Center as they stood during this time, as like this perfect symbol of the era of reproduction of that closed system itself, being like the duplicates, how that kind of maps onto this, like the Cold War era being, okay, so you had the Soviet Union and the United States kind of counterpoints to one another, providing a stability. And he makes this very like prescient comment that, one empire itself would ultimately collapse on itself, that I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's a really interesting way to like relate Baudrillard to sort of the larger like global political context as well. I'm already looking down at this quote that you pulled that I find really interesting. He says, the very definition of the real with a lowercase r is that of which it is possible to provide an equivalent reproduction. So I was curious kind of what your take on that was before we talk about the hyperreal.
The very definition of the real is that which it is possible to provide an equivalent reproduction. That's really interesting. I'm so like, it's difficult because I'm so immersed in the idea that of Lacan's version of the real, and the real being like something that can't be reproduced or like that defies signification.
Yeah.
So the very definition of the real is that which is possible to provide an equivalent reproduction. I don't know what that is getting at, to be honest.
Well, I'm almost wondering if in the second sort of progression of the simulation that he talks about, the simulacra, how I can imagine like in like a material factory, you're producing something, right? And let's say that you have like a mold of something, like a pin or like, you know, any sort of like commodity that's based on use value. It's like I can imagine that if you were to produce a bunch of pins like right next to each other from the same machines using the same molds, the same process, that to some degree, I'm wondering if he's saying like, well, those pins and in that phase of production, those are like real with a lowercase r, precisely because you can make a bunch of them in this material way. And at least there's some idea, I know there would be like discrepancies, but to some idea, you could make an equivalent reproduction of the same thing. And I wonder if in his idea, like in the hyperreal, there is no real that we're referencing anymore. It's like whenever I replicate an image, like in Warhol, right? Or like if I can digitally replicate a bunch of images and I can like cut and paste like a bunch of, you know, shit posts or memes, right? Is that the same thing as replicating something in an equivalent way, the way that I would whenever I made a pin or something like that in a factory?
Yeah, because it's only simulation. There is no real, like, I guess, corporeal form of it. I think this next bit is really good, though. I love this. This is fantastic. This idea of the hyperreal as an aesthetic hallucination of reality.
When that post-structuralism hits just right, that is such a great phrase.
I mean, that's perfect. It's like, it's all just this self-referential system of signs, and this is actually in the context of that stranger than fiction idea. And now he's saying, like, today in our current world, there's no fiction that life can even confront or conquer. It's all totally contingent. It's all on this whole mishmash of signs and simulacra simulation that are all kind of swirling about.
I wonder if this in some way is like why Baudrillard was so pissed about how the Wachowskis rendered the Matrix in the film, is because, you know, in the Matrix, the idea is like, well, there is this hallucinatory veil over reality, right? But it's still connected to something real that you could then like physically resist. Right. And I wonder if like part of what irked Baudrillard about it was like in his theory, it's like, no, like the whole point is like the Matrix is something that exists wholly on its own and there's no way to access like the corporeal through it. It's like, it is completely autonomous and it's like a complete closed hallucination.
Yeah, I definitely think that makes sense. I also think like, what's that relationship to something like the lacking subject in Lacan as well, right?
Say more about that. What do you see the relationship being?
So for Lacan, there's the lack at the heart of the subjectivity, and the real is that which escapes signification. Once we're within the symbolic, we can't ever get back to the real. Yeah. And I think maybe that's the bit that I'm seeing the parallel with Baudrillard in, because he's saying, no, like the real no longer exists. You can't go there. It's impossible to go back to it. Trying to go back to some kind of real is a foolhardy, like it's a waste of time. Like you're just spinning your wheels. You're not going to ever be able to go back to that. Similarly to the way that Lacan describes the real and that kind of lacking subjectivity, once we're within the symbolic realm, we can't ever go back to that sort of pre-era where we're existing purely in the real.
So I actually think that was a really great connection to make. And I'm almost thinking about how this is by definition what it is to be a conservative reactionary, is to say that, well, we've now crossed into this like simulation where like, oh, all the kids with their iPhones and their, you know, like transgenderism and whatever the fuck it is that conservatives are saying. And the idea is like what they want is to be able to go back. Like if we could just go back to a previous era, right? I mean, that's the whole point of like Make America Great Again. But the whole idea of like why that's a hyper real simulation is because the America that you want to go back to never existed. Like it's a complete fantasy. So I mean, I think that's actually spot on. And it's kind of also this sort of push to say that in a sense, like once you are thrown or like trying to sort of like pushed into the symbolic order, which is like defined by the other, right? That is like, you know, giving you these weird demands that you're not really sure what they mean. You're not ever sure how to satisfy them. There is no way to go back to the capital R real where you could somehow like return to some prior state where that won't be your condition. It's like you're kind of cursed with being in this order and you got to deal with that now.
And I think there's a relationship there to Death Drive too, that maybe we'll circle back around to, but I think, I don't know, just to put a pin in that.
Mm-hmm.
Moving forward, I think underscoring this too is this idea that what makes exchange make sense is that objects have a value outside of the exchange itself. Baudrillard's disputing this and saying, no, it's the reverse. We don't get an idea of an objective world until we're already in the realm of signification or the symbolic order, using Lacanian terminology. And we don't get the idea of natural value of objects until we're already inside that process, already like frozen in the amber of the symbolic.
Yeah, I love this. This is like such a great psychoanalytic, but also this is kind of exactly what talking about like old school like structuralism, like Claude Lévi-Strauss talked about with the raw and the cooked. It's sort of like you can't even conceptualize that there would be something raw until you have the ability to cook food, and then you retroactively then say, well, whatever lies outside of this must be what is raw food and not cooked food. And a similar way is like we only understand nature as a concept, like capital N nature, once we're already sort of thrown into civilization and technological society. It's like this weird retroactive thing of like trying to posit what must exist outside.
That's pretty Hegelian, right? That kind of reversal.
Yeah, I mean, to me, everything is Hegelian, but you know.
Baudrillard is actually being fairly, I think, dialectical throughout this entire book. And I mean, I guess that's probably just out of old habit to some extent, but I think he's, even though like to some degree he's making moves towards going past Marx, he's still kind of caught up in sort of dialectical approach.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I see that too as not necessarily like dialectical in terms of that like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, like dumb guy dialectics, but more of just the idea of like you have these like two opposing categories and they sort of like mutually determine themselves, but then also like exist in tension and contradiction, but like depend on each other. And that's something that like gets sort of played out in new contexts and new developments of how they relate.
Yeah, I think that the important part to draw out in this context is that dependence upon one another.
Yeah.
And that plays into that idea of death itself too, right? Like death and life and that demarcation line, that tension between those two states or what have you. Like that's a perfect example, or like perfect fits into that model really well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, and just to connect it back to symbolic exchange.
And then we can move on to chapter 3, which is fashion, or the enchanting spectacle of the code.
So can I just say before we do this that I am so glad we get to talk about fashion on this show, because one of the most influential things I've ever read that really made a huge impact on me is the sociologist George Simmel's essay on fashion and how the increasing urbanization of life necessitated changes in fashion to sort of signify class differences to each other. So it's this old, like, I don't think it's super well known. I don't know. I'll put a link in the show notes for it. But that essay to me was just like the connection up of like changes in society, like urbanization, class society, but how fashion is like a symbolic like representation of that in social relations is still to this day like one of my favorite things I've ever read. So anyway, I'm just like super, big excited that we get to talk about fashion.
I'll read from the text here because I think this is something we should reference briefly, because this kind of exemplifies, I think, that commodity fetishization to some degree that plays in here. Is under the sign of the commodity, love becomes prostitution. Under the sign of fashion, it is the object relation itself that disappears, blown to pieces by a cool and unconstrained sexuality. Under the sign of the commodity, time is accumulated like money. Under the sign of fashion, it is exhausted and discontinued an entangled cycle. Today, every principle of identity is affected by fashion precisely because of its potential to revert all forms to non-origin and recurrence. Fashion is always retro, but always on the basis of the abolition of the passé, the past, the spectral death and resurrection of forms. So we can see this playing out in terms of, and even this is a good way to consider the procession of simulacra, simulation as well, because you have something like, I've used the example in the past of like broguing on shoes, which was like now we associate it, I think, with like a high fashion, or like there's a bourgeois sort of affect in terms of broguing on shoes. But really, like originally at some point, this was more related to like country living in England, and kind of like being an approach to like wicking moisture out of shoes that now has become disentangled from that original kind of use value. And now it's achieved this sort of simulated value that's totally separated from that original like beginning. So I think that's a good way to model or map onto procession of simulacra.
That's really fascinating. I'm trying to think of other things in terms of like fashion that are almost like
I mean,
they
jeans
start
too are a good example. Jeans themselves, like they were kind of workwear, right?
Yeah.
And now they've been deterritorialized and reterritorialized into something else that now it's like the casual thing, and like rich people wear jeans, but originally it was like a workwear kind of thing.
I'm also thinking about the sort of symbol of the very, very large like Ford truck that, you know, was designed specifically to have a very functional use value, but now is like it doesn't have to be connected to that in any way. It's all about this sort of aesthetic exchange, like simulacra of it, of just like, oh, well, what does this represent, and how does it reference like a certain kind of cultural identity, and how that sort of helps define me as a subject by how I relate to it as this like symbol.
Right, and how you sort of using these, like now consumption is constructing your identity and signaling to other individuals that you have a certain standing because you possess a specific type of a commodity.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is great too, I think. A great way to conceptualize fashion, because you'll see like he describes fashion moves in these cycles, and like you'll have, you know, hippie influences from the 60s and then 70s and then 80s, or like military wear is always being cycled back into existence and putting its own like spin on it, or it's mashing up different elements of these different types of fashion from the past, but totally decontextualized, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what Frederick Jameson talks about in his work on postmodernism, how essentially what postmodernism is essentially this sort of constant hearkening back with a nostalgia for past forms, but this weird sort of like mishmashing of them all together without any like actual reference to what was really going on, or what was actually like the context in which they emerged. And so like to me, fashion is always like one of the most beautiful places to see this play out, because of how like, yeah, now think about like vaporwave and like 80s like fashion and stuff. Like now this is this sort of like, there was the spectral death of that form, and now it's resurrection in this new way, but in this purely sort of like referential, I don't even know if I would call it nostalgic. I'm not sure people harken back to the 80s and like that aesthetic with like a sort of like lost, like melancholic approach. But it's almost like this, it doesn't even have to be connected to like your actual experience. It's just this sort of like play of signs of what was kind of dominant in consumer society at that point.
Yes, absolutely. Do you want to end this chapter? I think there's a quote about the dead labor of signs that wrap up the chapter on, that I think is really, really interesting. But a couple of other quotes before we hit that. Spectacle is our fashion, and intensified and reduplicated sociality, enjoying itself aesthetically, the drama and change in place of actual change. Oof. Which I think goes to what you were just talking about.
That just like hit me in the fucking gut. Like that last phrase is really beautiful.
While it is true that one can always escape the reality principle of the content, one can never escape the reality principle of the code. Even while rebelling against the content, one more and more closely obeys the logic of the code. And so that's, I think what he's saying here is, though, you know, you can try to use these, like the aesthetics of fashion, to rebel against capitalism. You're still participating in the logic of the code. You're not really doing something revolutionary.
Yeah, and I think what's so important about this goes back to the fact that, like, in this period of simulation, it's about the structural component, because it isn't about the content. It isn't like, well, we're going to rebel with using the right particular signs. It's that the structure itself of the code is already like the system itself. Like that's what you're captured by, is like you're still obeying the structural logic of simulation and the code itself. And it doesn't matter what content you push into that, it's still the structure that's sort of dominant.
You think that's air you're breathing now?
It's trying to do battle on the plane of the real, which we said earlier, you can't defeat the system on the plane of the real itself.
I think that's interesting to reference back to, just really quickly, to that phrase where we talked about maybe like him saying that a gift is the only thing that could like force capitalism to respond in a way that would bring about its catastrophe and death, is to say that there has to be some, because it's funny because that's almost the most prescriptive thing you're going to hear Baudrillard say, but this quote is precisely why people see him as being this sort of like nihilist that thinks there's no escape. But I don't know. I mean, I think a generous reading of Baudrillard would have you say that he's saying that as long as you're operating within the oppressive structure of the code, there's no escape. So you have to figure out a way to operate like not on that structural logic of the code. And so I don't know. I mean, I could definitely see how you could like read Baudrillard as being like a hyper nihilist with like, and we're all just stuck. And maybe he doesn't give good answers of how to like, you know, what the gift could be that would bring about capitalism's own demise. But I don't know. I mean, those are like sort of interesting to read together, I think.
I think he progressively becomes more nihilistic as time passes, as like later work. But I do think that ultimately the symbolic exchange is perhaps that prescriptive element, or like the possibility, or that being like the weakness or the chink in the armor of capital is symbolic exchange, like specifically through the gift itself.
Yeah.
Although obviously, like, how the fuck do you abstract? Like, that's incredibly abstract. Like, how do you concrete that materially, or how do you turn that into something material? I don't know how to answer that question.
I can hear my old Marxist-Leninist self in the background saying, how do I build a vanguard party around the gift?
Yeah, right? Exactly. But I do want to finish up chapter 3 on this specific quote, and I referred to it a little bit earlier, but the aesthetic of renewal. Fashion draws triviality from the death and modernity of the déjà vu. This is the despair that nothing lasts, and the contemporary enjoyment of knowing that beyond this death, every form has always the chance of a second existence, which is never innocent since fashion consumes the world and the real in advance. It is the weight of all the dead labor of signs bearing on a living signification, with a magnificent forgetting, a fantastic ignorance which has méconnaissance bracketed out.
Yeah, that's a great quote.
I don't know what it means, but I don't know that something. What is it that like dead labor? Like he's adding on this signs element to this kind of classic Marxist quote, right?
Yeah, the idea that like history weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, on the minds of the living. Yeah. Which is from the 18th Brumaire. It's interesting because I really like this because he's saying that like in fashion, there's this sort of like death is trivialized. Like it doesn't actually, like it doesn't have this radical indeterminacy, because there's this idea that, well, even as trends come and go and nothing lasts, we always know that there's this enjoyment and anticipation that there will be like a renewal of that form at some later point, which then will kind of be this like dead weight of this like past signification and this past system of signs of like a particular fashion or like a trend. It's like, oh, you can always assume that that will return at some point, and there's always this sort of like nightmarish anticipation or sort of triviality of like, it doesn't matter if things come and go because they'll always come back again. It's this like eternal repetition of the same, almost, is how I read that.
Yeah, it almost kind of ties in as well to that idea that, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes or something. Because I think that's how fashion works materially, just in the sense of like as a consumer, exactly that phenomenon that you're discussing is like the 80s style, or like, I don't know, military dress with like epaulets on the shoulders, right? That structure will repeat itself in a different way. So it won't necessarily be in a complete 100% replication.
Yeah.
But it is there's referencing that, and then it's mixing that up with a bunch of different other different signs.
I think you actually hit on something really just like beautiful that we were trying to work out earlier. It isn't reproduction of an equivalence, it's like a referencing of something, and those are like two totally different things. Like, because equivalently reproducing something isn't the same as referencing it, because the reference is always like something that has distortions or like differences, but it isn't sort of equivalently reproducing it in the same way that like, even though, you know, people go to like vintage like shops and buy like vintage clothing, most of the time the way that fashion works, it isn't like you would see someone dressed, you know, 100% equivalent to someone in like 1973, but they might be referencing it with certain pieces of clothing that they wear, certain like fashion trends that they're trying to like reincorporate or like revivify from the dead or something.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to frame it. I think it's something interesting too is just in the way that it's changed, I think, now in the era of Instagram and influencers. But I think at one time, and maybe this also goes to the procession of the simulacra, is that like the vintage shoppers were the ones who were like driving fashion, and then like there would be people paying attention to them and like kind of doing these ethnography like studies of what's popular and so forth. And then the fashion companies would try to reproduce what they're seeing kind of quote unquote organically develop through vintage shopping, and then kind of take their, like they commodify that. And that's the reterritorialization of like anytime you're trying to do something novel, capitalism is like able to reintegrate that.
Yeah.
And sell it rather than like the vintage shopper being, you know, I don't know, some kind of liberatory thing. Like maybe it is at the beginning, but then it gets just subverted back into the code itself.
Yeah, like so many things, right? It's like maybe there was this initial like radical potential for it, but then the speed at which it then gets reincorporated back into the code is the thing you have to be really wary of.
But I think that kind of wraps up chapter 3 for me, unless you had any other questions or points that we didn't hit that you feel are relevant.
No, I feel like we thoroughly pummeled chapter 3 from your notes. No, that was good. I was super excited to talk about that, so I'm glad we got to unpack a lot of that shit.
Chapter 4 is models of the body. I don't have a whole lot to contribute, but I think this is a very interesting argument that Baudrillard's laying out in terms of the body, and he has like these 4 different conceptions of how the body is viewed by different, I don't know if you want to call them institutions necessarily, but I think maybe that's the best way to conceive of it.
Yeah.
And so the first one he gives is medicine views the body as the corpse, and in terms of how they're like, medicine is not like they're reconceptualizing the body in this way, right? For their purpose is the corpse. That's like the most relevant conception of the body in the context of medicine. And then the second is religion, which views things in terms of like the corporeality, the flesh, you know, the model of like the flesh being weak, or like it's kind of that religious view of the body as tainted, as it is like there's a crudeness to it as opposed to spirit. The flesh is weak. What is it, the saying? It's like the mind is willing, but the flesh is weak. So I think that's what is being got at there. And then in terms of political economy, Baudrillard says that they're robot, and which makes sense even if you're not discussing an actual like physical robot, the mechanization of labor, like the human being as a robot in terms of production, because it is following, you know what I mean? It's mechanically performing an action without any kind of necessarily real like agency as part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think another piece too about this political economy and robots as a model of the body has to do with the sort of the concept of Homo Economicus, and that the way you understand economic systems is precisely through people maximizing their own rational self-interest. Like that is a very like roboticized, like sort of like hyper sort of diminished view of like human beings as only operating as if we are these like flesh and blood robots, right? Just maximizing our rational self-interest. I will tell you at some point, an interesting book that you might want to check out is a book by Philip Murawski, who I'm a really, really big fan of. He wrote a book called Machine Dreams, and it's sort of the way that cybernetics eventually came to dominate our model of economics, in the like especially after like post World War II with like John von Neumann and like people at the Rand Corporation and things like that. But the idea is that like cybernetics and the idea of like feedback loops and like game theory and like rational like self-interest and like how that came to be so dominant was precisely from the same people who were developing like robotic AI systems and like feedback loops. It's like it's the same model of thinking, and there was like a very, very close relationship between the two.
Chapter 4, I didn't have a whole lot to. Oh yeah, we also forgot though the political economy of the sign is the fourth version of this, and the model of the body there being the mannequin.
I love that.
Yeah, which is like a blank, like the tabla rasa thing that just can be adorned by signs, and like just this sort of blank subject that gets filled in by signifiers.
And that references a material corporeal body, but which is not that. It's this sort of like plasticized like representation of that. And, and that's the funny thing about mannequins, right? Is like mannequins never actually are like the same. Like you can never mistake a mannequin for like a real corporeal body. That's why I think sometimes you see this like as a weird thing, especially in like sci-fi film or like certain representations. I'm thinking about Blade Runner. Whenever he's like trying to find, it's the replicant, the one who ends up like doing she ends up like meeting the robot designer, and her and Roy end up staying at his place in like the big abandoned building. Do you remember her name?
Pris,
yeah. So whenever he's hunting Pris, there's that really beautiful scene where she is like hiding as if she's a mannequin in the window. And so that scene to me in like Blade Runner is a great just like little moment where you see this sort of like political economy of the sign and the replicant as, something that is not human, but yet references and like tries to replicate the human.
I think it's safe to move on to chapter 5.
All right.
And this is our big political economy and death is the chapter. And this is really the like biggest, most meaty chapter in the whole book, and where he focuses so much energy, and there's so many quotes that you could drag out from this particular chapter. But I think this is like the meat of the symbolic exchange and death really hits home in this chapter. He kind of opens with something that's, I think, interesting or relevant to us in the sense that he's talking about racism being a modern development. Previous races or cultures were ignored or eliminated, but never under the sign of a universal reason. There is no criterion of man, no split from the inhuman. There are only differences with which to oppose death, but it is our undifferentiated concept of man that gives rise to discrimination. This is kind of, I think, going back, touching on that anthropological element that probably goes back to Maus, and this recognition that in the past there probably was genocide of different people or groups in human society, cultures, or what have you, but it wasn't defined under like this sort of scientific rationalistic element of something like a concept like racism, for example. It's a more modern approach.
Yeah, we've actually talked about this a lot in our Foucault series on Society Must Be Defended, how like Foucault's conception was that even though there were things like genocide and like this sort of understanding of like races and like peoples and how that would like justify things like slavery or whatever it might have been, this sort of understanding of racism like takes on a new form in like the modern era. And so I think it's like, we've actually talked about this a little bit on the show, and just to understand that like racism isn't this like temporally constant thing that's always functioned in the same way, no matter when and where you're describing it. Like, again, it's like a material thing that like shifts and like changes with like material things shifting and changing as well.
Definitely. I don't know, it's kind of interesting that he even brings this up. I'm not sure what the tie-in is here to like the symbolic exchange and death element, other than maybe recognizing that sort of that co-constitutive aspect of, to have racism, like you have to have the concept of whiteness, for example, has to exist before you can do that. And you can't do that until you're in the sort of symbolic range. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, well, racial categories
tied into that earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, racial categories themselves are like highly contextualized symbolic representations of like whole general like categories. I mean, maybe this is like part of it too, right? Because he's saying that the code and simulation only exists to the degree that like an abstract signification like sort of develops its own autonomy separate from like a material corporeal thing. I mean, this is exactly how people talk about whiteness now. It's like whiteness is just this like abstracted like category, and like being white is an abstracted sort of like signifier that is never really referenced as actually having like a specific historical material kind of component. Usually depends on who you read. Like if you read someone like Neil Irvin Painter and like the history of whiteness or whatever, it's like, or the history of white people, you can find that, or like Theodore Allen. But I think to some degree it's like, I think the way we think about race usually, especially in like racist sorts of like worldviews, is very much like races are just these like abstracted categories that don't even necessarily have reference to any kind of like lowercase r real.
Yeah, that maps. I hate to read long passages of text, but I feel like the only way to really, like, I mean, it's hard to paraphrase Baudrillard here when he says, that's kind of following so well. And really, that what he's getting at here that I think is so interesting is, like, strictly speaking, we no longer know what to do with them, being the dead, since today it is not normal to be dead. And this is something new within culture. To be dead is now an unthinkable anomaly. Nothing is as offensive as this. Death is a delinquency and an incurable deviancy. The dead are no longer inflicted on any place or space-time. They can find no resting place. They are thrown into a radical utopia. They are no longer even packed in and shut up, but obliterated. But we know these hidden places signify the factory no longer exists because labor is everywhere. The prison no longer exists because arrests and confinements pervade social space-time. And then further, he goes on, the asylum is reabsorbed into the core of the social field because normality has reached the point of perfection and assumed the characteristics of the asylum because the virus of confinement has worked its way into every fiber of normal existence. So it is with death. Death is ultimately nothing more than the social line of demarcation, separating the dead from the living, and therefore it affects both equally. Against the senseless illusion of the living, of the willing the living to the exclusion of the dead, against the illusion that life reduces to an absolute surplus value by extracting death from it. The indestructible logic of symbolic exchange reestablishes the equivalence of life and death and the indifferent fatality of survival. In survival, death is repressed. Life itself, in accordance with that well-known ebbing away, would be nothing more than a survival determined by death. And so what I think...
It's like, what do you want to do with that? Where do you want to start?
So I think this might be getting at this idea, too, that's here about really when it comes to our lives, we are sort of putting off our death by participating in society, in labor, and performing labor instead of dying right away through like starvation or something like that. We're prolonging that by producing, by being inculcated into the productive capacity of society, or consumptive rather, and in this context. So I think maybe that's what this is going towards a little bit, right?
Yeah, that would make sense too, because I'm almost thinking about the sort of Lacanian interpretation, or like depending on who you read, of the relationship between life drives and the death drive, and how there is a way, and the more radical way to read death drive is that in a sense there is nothing but the death drive. They're just different ways of like dying differently. Like every time you do something to sustain your life, it's just basically like postponing death a little bit, and there's a certain amount of like pleasure or like gratification you get from that. But there is a certain way that, in a sense, like consumption, pursuing commodities, like pursuing pleasures, are still death drive at their core. They're just, again, like finding different circuitous routes to stave off eventually the same thing that all of them are leading to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that, and to go back to our example earlier from, TJ Maxx, like that's a really interesting model or like example to kind of try to think through this death drive, because like it's such a weird contrast, because you literally have the immediacy of death from the virus element of it, and then you have that like death drive of consumption too, that are butting heads, like that weird like that's a dialectical relationship right there too, right? It's bizarre.
Yeah. Well, I'm almost thinking about, you had mentioned, I know we talked about this on the Zizek episode, about, in some ways whenever you see people like going to the Capitol and staging these demonstrations to, like basically go get your hair cut again, if you're like a big boy with your AR-15 and really just want to go to the salon and, and get your flat top trimmed up, in some ways it's like that is also like two different forms of the death drive playing out. It's like the death drive of like where, and I do think this, it's like I think there's a pleasure and like a perverse pleasure in doing that. But it's not just because you can basically display your, I don't know, whatever it is, like your masculinity or like your defiance against the state and like the oppression of like the libs. I think there's a certain way that it's like, you're gaining pleasure and satisfaction precisely because it brings you closer to death. It like that is like pure death drive. It's like there's a pleasure in the fact that you're exposing yourself to death.
And maybe that's the genesis of that ressentiment of it, of the whole thing, is like, you're denying me the jouissance of confronting death directly. Ooh, that's really good. That's great. That's fucking great.
Yeah, but no, I think that's right? Because it's like, it's basically saying, oh, you're not going to let me consume? Well, then I'm going to encounter the death drive in a different way then. But like, there's a like weird jouissance in that. And I think it isn't, just about kind of simplistic culture war, political ideology perspective. It's like, there's something much more deep and like psychoanalytic going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Undeniably so, I think. I think that really goes to, I mean, the crazy world that we live in, to me, like, has made psychoanalysis so relevant.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, psychoanalysis had kind of fallen out of fashion. But now in the Trump era, like, I don't know how else you explain what any of this is.
Yeah. I mean, I
guess Baudrillard too goes into that. Like, he's using psychoanalysis as well.
Yeah, we're uncanceling the future and we're bringing psychoanalysis back. That's part of our project on Red Library for sure.
I'm curious here. I don't exactly understand this, but I think the meat of this is this bit here. He's saying, okay, against the senseless illusion of the living, of willing the living to the exclusion of death, against the illusion that reduces life to an absolute surplus value by subtracting death from it. The indestructible logic of symbolic exchange reestablishes the equivalence of life and death in the indifferent fatality of survival, reducing life to an absolute surplus value by extracting death.
I mean, this is really interesting because, again, I'm going to use my little dialectic hands for this. I mean, reading this, it's almost as if he's saying that whenever we think about death, that what we have to be wary of is exactly that sort of like a mutually constitutive dichotomy that we talked about with like raw and cooked, or like nature and civilization. So I read him as saying that death is the social line of demarcation separating dead from living. And so in a way, he's saying that death equally determines those who are dead, but also those who are living. And I think what he's saying is that a lot of times what we sort of imagine is that like to be alive is to essentially like either negate death. Being alive is just like the absence of being dead, and I think that's why he's saying like that reduces life to an absolute surplus value by subtracting death from it. So I think what he's saying is like, if we conceptualize being alive in the first place, and this is real philosophical shit here, like if being alive in itself is just simply the negation or the extraction of death from this category of being alive, it creates this logic that these two aren't mutually like determined by death itself. Like to be dead would then just be the reinclusion of death into the sort of like commodity of life, if that makes sense. So, I mean, I guess what he's saying here is that if you were to engage in symbolic exchange, the way that we were talking about initially, it's almost as if somehow death would now equally determine who is dead and who is living again in a different way than how we typically encounter it. So I guess he's saying in survival, death is repressed. Life itself, in accordance with that well-known ebbing away, would be nothing more than as a survival determined by death. I guess he's saying that in this sort of logic of symbolic exchange, life is only like a survival against the inevitability of death, like the radical indeterminacy of death. Okay. Yeah, and so this actually, I think, is kind of Lacanian too, right? It's exactly what we were talking about with the death drive. Like everything that's keeping you engaged in like life drives and preserving your existence are in some way still underneath, like those are still death drive. It's that, you know, you're like dying in a different way, or like you're sort of engaging the death drive in these different sort of forms and sort of different variations. But at the end of the day, like life is still fundamentally like just a sort of perpetual survival against the winning of the death drive. That's my way of reading this to try to understand what the fuck he's trying to say here. But I think that is like different, right? Because we think mostly in our society right now, death is something that is, again, like negated, is sort of imagined to not exist. Everything we do isn't like we don't see the way that we like engage in exercise or like beauty routines or whatever. Like we don't see these things as like a perpetual survival determined by death. we see it as a way to negate and disavow death. Like there's a very different logic at play. And I think this is exactly why, the whole idea of beauty standards in especially Western capitalist society are very much around like youth and the purity of youth, and like you can never be old because to be old is not to be productive anymore. It's to not be a suitable sexual partner. It's to, all this other stuff. And so there's this necessity to disavow that death even exists to preserve this sort of like simulacra of what it is to be human. And so I think for Baudrillard, like that's what I read is him saying that like, this is fundamentally a different kind of logic than to say that like every moment of my life is just like a kind of lucky survival against like the sort of radical indeterminacy of death that can happen at any moment.
I think he even mentions at some point this idea of the retired as like their own, since they've been removed from production or whatever, like they're their own sort of category as well.
Yeah. I mean, did you ever see that movie About Schmidt? I mean, that is essentially like the whole point of that, right? It's like in this particular logic, what happens whenever the inevitability, like the radical indeterminacy, or like I would almost say the radical inevitability of aging and death is unavoidable any longer. Your children have left. You can no longer like create a new family per se, at least in the traditional like nuclear family sense. You're no longer a productive worker. Like the amount of existential like devastation that has on people in like especially like Western European society and in the States in the imperial core, suicide rates, like substance use rates, like all this stuff like skyrockets at that part of life precisely because now like all of a sudden it's like the real does encroach upon you, right? It's like you can no longer deny that like death has always determined my life in this way, like this was inevitable, and now I can no longer like hide from that. And then we'd like shuttle those people off and put them in nursing homes, or like they exist in these weird nomadic lifestyles of driving back and forth across the country in RVs in the States. I think all of that is like this weird sort of like category that most of us don't know how to take account of in the way that we understand basic social life in the United States.
Definitely. To move forward a bit, he goes into this like the Lacanian, well, you might be able to articulate this better, understand exactly the relationship here, because we have symbolic, real, imaginary as sort of this portion of the chapter. And I don't know that this is if he's exactly referring to them in the same way that Lacan does. He says the symbolic is neither a concept, an agency, a category, or a structure, but an act of exchange and a social relation which puts an end to the real, which resolves the real, and at the same time puts an end to the opposition between the real and the imaginary. The Initiatory Act is the reverse of our reality principle. It shows that the reality of birth derives solely from the separation of life and death. I've always had a little bit of difficulty kind of getting at what like these three registers are for Lacan. Because I know the real is that which escapes signification, and then the imaginary would be the sort of not in our like concept of like imagining, but like image based. So my favorite discussion of this distinction and sort of these three different registers lately has been Mari Rudy, because apparently everything I read now is just like Mari Rudy is the shit, and like I reference Mari Rudy and everything. But my understanding of her, and we're going to talk about this specific book on a future episode, so I won't like get super in depth on it, but she had this way of saying that like the real is sort of this like radical contingency of things that escape symbolic representation in any kind of way. They can never be fully accounted for in like subjectivity or in signification. So things like, the act of death or like radical indeterminacy in some degree. I'd say that's capital R real. Symbolic is sort of, again, like the system. I guess like it's interesting because like Baudrillard is saying like it's not, the symbolic isn't a concept, it's not an agency, a category, nor a structure, like quote unquote, but an act of exchange, a social relation. So I think this actually does track a little bit, because the idea is that the symbolic is sort of like social norms, conventions, language, social relations, all this stuff that's kind of like exists outside of you that then comes to sort of basically like determine like your
your sort of subjectivity, your experience of the world, like how you think language works, and then like constructs your identity in some sort of way.
Yeah. Okay, so that's pretty much mapping onto like the being ingratiated in the symbolic order.
Yes. So the imaginary piece, you're right. It's not like imagination so much, but like an image. And so the way that Mari Rudy talks about imaginary, which I found really helpful, is she basically says that this is almost like what would track as the ego in Freud. So the imaginary is sort of the place in which like your own representation of yourself to yourself as like a symbol or as an image, that's kind of where that register comes into play. So basically like my image of myself or my imaginary register would be like how I conceptualize myself as a subject for myself. And so this would have to do with like what my personality is, like what my character is, like my history as an individual and how I make sense of that. It's almost like, I hate to use this word, but it's kind of like my self-narrative about who I am. Like that's my imaginary sort of register. And that's, again, this like sort of intermediated sort of realm between like the symbolic out there and the real, which is this thing that escapes like all symbolization or even all like understanding of myself, right? That's why like the unconscious is something that is like the connection to the real. Like the unconscious is sort of like the real registering in you, which is never fully represented to yourself.
Okay, I like that.
Are you buying that?
Yeah, no,
let's go with it.
That's good. That's perfect. I mean, I've read it. It's just like, do you ever have moments where you can kind of just get at what something is gesturing at, but you can't articulate it? You know what I mean? You can't find the words to describe it.
The whole reason I have this podcast, Cooper, is to give me an excuse to try to make sense of this shit and to do exactly that. I will tell you though, I mean, after reading Lacan and all this stuff for years now, it actually wasn't until I read that Mari Rudy book recently, which actually one of our patrons recommended that we're going to do an episode on, that basically Mari Rudy had a way of describing that like for the first time I was like, that is so completely crystal clear to me. Like, why did I never encounter this way of describing it before? So I think it's a combination of like time, but then like going back over the concepts multiple times and like sort of unpacking them and seeing different ways to explain them.
For sure. And I'm curious too, like he's often, not just here, but throughout Baudrillard's work, he's referring to the same three registers. And it's not clear to me yet because my prior experience with Baudrillard I didn't have the context of Lacan to ground this in. So I'm like wondering what that Venn diagram looks like in terms of their projects, because even in this book, he is referencing Lacan here and there, and he is providing some critiques. There's definitely a Lacan critique that I could pull up, if we needed to, but I don't know. I think that's interesting.
I just like reading back over Baudrillard a little bit now, like years later. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think I ever realized how much like the relationship between him and Lacan, like how it's pretty present, even if he's not directly talking about Lacan. I mean, I will say this is an interesting thing to read in relationship to our McGowan reading series. He says that from this point on, the obsession with death and the will to abolish death through accumulation become the fundamental motor of the rationality of political economy. So it's funny because I could definitely see how, like in Baudrillard's perspective on this particular text, like the idea is that the need to abolish or to sort of like abstract out life as like the complete surplus value of death and then just like operate on surplus value. It's like everything is about maximizing surplus value and hence maximizing our experience of life, right? And so that becomes like the fundamental like motor of rationality of political economy and consumption, right? Like basically everything you're consuming is in some way like repetitively trying to abolish death every single time you purchase a commodity. What's really interesting though is that, McGowan's perspective here would probably say that actually what you are doing, it's like you're not trying to abolish death. It's like you're sort of realizing that you're trying to find dissatisfaction in new ways because like dissatisfaction is actually the thing that you're getting satisfaction from. I mean, it's just kind of like an interesting like connection to McGowan, because I feel like McGowan would read that like very, like the logic of that would be very, very different.
I think so too. I don't know, just have always, just at a certain level, I've wanted to do this for a while, is like this sort of synthesis of Baudrillard and Lacan applied to shitposting. And like, legitimately, something I'd like to do is write a paper. I've got a lot of primary sources that I've got to read first to really flesh it out. But I have this idea that like that's the kind of perfect like using those two thinkers, they're both hitting on different sides, or like, I don't know, there's a certain overlap in terms of both of their projects that I think would really map well onto like the desire element within shitposting. Like the desire for the recognition of the other, I think, is involved.
Yeah.
But also this like idea of the hyperreal and all of that I think plays into it, as well as that kind of just production for production's sake is sort of like what shitposting is, right? There's no like real value or like even exchange value. I guess there is exchange in the sense of how I guess engagement is right. That's kind of the capital of Twitter, for example, is I get the recognition of the other when I see the like or the retweet. That fuel, that kind of, I don't know what that does for me, is that's the jouissance is being recognized.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely part of it, right? Like what is the nature of the blue check except like the ultimate recognition by the big other to say like, yes, you are right now. Yeah, like that's exactly what the blue check has always been about. But I will tell you this, and this is just something to let marinate. If you truly want to honor Zadie Baudrillard, whenever you write this paper, just know that you don't actually have to read any of those primary sources. The opening quote of Simulacra and Simulation is an Old Testament quote in which Baudrillard just completely made it up and just said, this is from the Old Testament. You know, so just remember, you could do this exact thing. Be like, oh, I have like all these citations and references. I just made all this up. I didn't read any of these.
Ecclesiastes, right?
Yeah, that's what it was. Ecclesiastes. Thank you. Yes.
Back to our big buddy JB. I'm going to skip forward a couple of quotes because I think this tied into that last one pretty well. Our whole culture is just one effort to dissociate life and death, to ward off the ambivalence of death in the interest of life as value and time as the general equivalent.
Whew, that's spicy right there.
The general equivalent is sort of what money, like we talked about money earlier in the episode, right? Yeah. As mediating equivalency. But I can't quite articulate this. I do understand, okay, so we're trying to dissociate life and death. What's the mechanism that makes us in our current culture push out death as the exception, as the, I forget what terminology he used, but there's a better way to describe it. Like it's no longer normal to die or to be dead. Yeah. That has been removed in our current culture.
I mean, in terms of like what the mechanism is, I mean, this is my own intuition about it. I mean, I think to some degree, let's take this for example, because this is actually a real life situation I had with someone once. This is also around the time I was doing a lot of psychedelics. So just keep in mind, I was like constantly feeling like I was confronting death and like radical indeterminacy all the time. So I remember I used to drive this like really shitty like 1999 Chevy Blazer, right? Now, part of why I drove the shitty Chevy Blazer is because I couldn't afford to drive anything else. It was the only thing I could afford to buy at that time. It was this like broken down piece of shit. So I remember I was talking with a friend of mine at the time, and I remember he was a fairly upper class guy from New York, and we like knew each other in the music scene. And I remember there was this one time we were like on the way to a show together, and he said, "When are you gonna buy like a new car?" And I just sort of like looked at him, and, you know, I was probably also having a salvia flashback at the same time. So keep that in mind. So, but, you know, I looked at him and I remember saying like, well, why do I need to buy a new vehicle? This one seems to work just fine. And I remember it was just this like radical cut where like it just stopped the conversation. We didn't talk any more about it as long as we knew each other. But this was like 10 years ago, and I still think about this because I think in a certain way, if death as like radical indeterminacy was like constantly encroaching upon your life, I do wonder if we would still have the same relationship to consumption and commodities that we do. Like, is there a way that if I was constantly faced with radical indeterminacy, maybe like what I actually care about and what I actually spend my time and my labor on, would it still be consumption in the same way? I could also see how like there's a hell of a lot more business in keeping people alive than in like having people focus on death all the time, right? There's whole industries built around like the medical industry, like the beauty industry. All these things are like built around the consumption of life. And this is what I think is really fascinating about this Baudrillard quote, because if life in itself is what is valuable for us, then time as the increase of my lifespan becomes the general equivalent of how I would then measure it. Because life is something that's really hard to like place a hard value on, right? Like it's hard to know, well, like what is happiness, right? Like what is a meaningful, fulfilling life? It's like these things are all highly subjective and like potentially even like nonsense to even think about. But if I can tell you how long I'm alive, if I can tell you how many years I'm going to be alive, well, that is an equivalent measurement that I can then use to compare values of life. And so I think that there's to me, it's actually a really kind of ingenious thing that Baudrillard does, because he says, we're trying to abstract death completely from the way we think about exchange. And just the same way we do with all value, if life is the opposite of what death is and the way we think about it, then I have to be able to measure it, and I have to be able to base exchange around it. And in capitalism, to exchange means you have to have some measurement, something to build equivalencies between what you're exchanging. Right. And so I think to me, that's kind of part of the material basis for it, is like basically to sort of drive consumption, but also to like build commodities around. I mean, it's like a hell of a lot easier, right? Like you can't imagine, I mean, maybe in some degree you could imagine like a whole economy built around the commodities of caskets and funeral homes and burials, right? But there's a pretty quick like theoretical horizon to that. Like there's a pretty set amount of space you could really go with that before you'd like exchange would then like break down. I don't know. I mean, so tell me what you think about that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I'm also, this is maybe too simple, but I'm thinking too like the consumption, the accumulation of resources as a way to ward off death.
Yeah.
And that being like a driving, like, I don't know, is that death drive? Is that what's driving the whole, like the whole aspect of consumption is like this kind of lizard brain accumulate resources to stave off death.
I mean, isn't that what the toilet paper run was about, right? It's like, I mean, think about it, because like, what was the whole point of that? Because the idea is like, well, what if I can't wipe my ass like in a pandemic? It's like, but why? It's like, because there is a logical connection, I think, especially in like Western Christian, like Judeo-Christian civilization, about excrement and like bodily filth is like connected to death and like disease in a certain way. Or just this idea of like, I don't want to be reminded that I'm like a human subject that like has all these like physical bodily processes. I mean, I think there are like connections there that you could flesh out about why like toilet paper of all things is what people went for.
That's funny. I had a post the other day that said something like coming to terms with the fact that I'm just a process or something, or coming to terms with, no, it was just simply coming to terms with being a process.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually like very elegantly said, because that's like the idea, right? Is like digestion, excretion, like is a constantly ongoing process. I mean, there's a certain way that I think there is like this connection to like disavowing death or extracting death from life. That's also, I think, very logically connected, I think, to this idea that like we need to deny all things about sickness, disease, excrement, like all this stuff about the human body that then has to also be disavowed.
What's interesting though too about the example you give with the toilet paper is that much like other things, like we talked about this in the context of the cereal flavors, like the cereal flavors are sort of superfluous in terms of reproducing our lives. Mm-hmm. Toilet paper as well is really like, in the grand scheme of things, you don't need toilet paper to even live, right?
Yeah.
There's the symbolic element of it. I don't know.
No,
I don't know where else to go with that, but you know what I mean? Like there's the toilet paper there's a weird, like it is, like you're saying, it is tied up into this kind of survival thing, but at the same time, it's not really real. It's not necessary.
It's ideologically mediated. Mediated. This is exactly why we talked about that in Zizek's book, right? That's why he says that this is actually trivializing the pandemic to react and just go like make a run on toilet paper, because a real serious response to this would actually be like nationalizing whole industries to make face masks and like PPEs and ventilators, so we'd actually have enough. It's like, so to just like react as if like I just need to make sure I can wipe my ass as like the most like sort of serious response we can take to the pandemic is in fact to sort of negate the larger structural ideological sort of questions about it.
I already am eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology.
There's one more quote that I think particularly interesting for both of us here is similarly, the infinite accumulation of time as value under the sign of general equivalence entails the absolute scarcity of time that is death, a contradiction in capitalism. No, communism in this instance is in solidarity with political economy, since in accordance with the same fantastic schema of eternal accumulation of productive forces, communism too aims for the abolition of death.
Shots fired at communism right there.
Right. And I think obviously this is an element where like Baudrillard's going, kind of post-Marx or even post-left or some sort of post-left or post-Marxist.
I definitely think post-standard like Soviet Stalinist orthodoxy of, essentially like all of history is this like progression towards complete democratization of like the productive forces and the control of those by the proletariat. I mean, I don't know. I feel like McGowan actually has similar critiques. And this is why he said recently in an interview on New Books in Critical Theory on his book on Hegel, he says like, oh, well, I'm not a Marxist, because he still thinks that Marxism posits an end to contradiction. Like in some way, Marxism still even tacitly presumes that there could be a point in the future where contradiction would no longer exist. I'm a McGowan fanboy hardcore. I don't know if I really agree with that personally. Like, I think maybe you could say, like, does Marx posit that? I don't know. I mean, I think that's a little iffy. I do know that the best Marxists that I read that are still around writing, I think, are actually trying to grapple with what does communism look like without an end to contradiction.
Right.
Frederick Jameson's
that's
essay.
The interesting thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think actually one of the best examples of this that I've seen, and it pissed a lot of people off, is Frederick Jameson's essay in American Utopia, which I know that Swampside Chats has done an episode on, and I want us to maybe do it at some point too. But I don't know. I mean, I just think that, to me, whenever someone like Baudrillard like invokes communism here, I mean, the question you just got to ask is like, well, who's communism? Like, who's writing and theorizing is he referencing here? But I will tell you this. I actually think that what a modern representation of what he is critiquing here is fully automated luxury communism. I absolutely think that's the kind of shit that he is critiquing that is still very relevant, right? This idea of we just want to consume and like have everything be under control of the people, but without any crisis. It's like we want all the like glory of consumer society without capitalism.
Yes. Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that was excellent. You nailed it.
Yeah. Also, I'm really about dragging fully automated luxury communism. I know that our peeps at the Regrettable Century are very good. Podreds are too, but I think there's something that is like really uncritical in the way that those sort of approaches get talked about, because in some ways it's like there's a certain non-critique of like the relationship between consumerism and like political economy and like what you think the end project is. And it's like, if the whole idea is to have consumer society but not necessarily have capitalism, it's like I think we need to go back and rethink some basic presuppositions here.
No, I would definitely agree. Although I don't know, I am somewhat fully automated luxury communist thing, like the post-scarcity element. I don't know. I think there is something interesting there, but yeah, it needs to be developed, I think, a lot more rigorously than what we've seen of it.
So that's the thing, is like, I really love the idea of post-scarcity, right? Post-scarcity in the sense of like everyone would have shit like food, housing, and medical care, right? But I think that it's very under-theorized to me, exactly like you're saying, because a lot of times post-scarcity is what we're post-scarcity about, I think sometimes is like uncritically gone from like basic needs into consumerism. And it's like, no, that's the thing that you got to critique, is that logical jump that's made.
Yeah. The commodity fetish element of it in particular as well. Like, we do have to abolish that, otherwise I don't want to get too left comm either with abolishing commodity production, but I definitely do, like, I don't know, to me I think that's it is important in my opinion. I kind of do, I have some sympathies in that direction as a kind of anarchist too. Like, I don't know where it fits in, but
I mean, it's just, at least it's important to like critically sort of discuss and think through these things, right? Like, you can't just assume that there's some way that us, being completely socialized from day one by our big other, which is the symbolic order of capitalism, doesn't still have a huge effect on like how you even conceptualize radical politics. This is like one of the whole basic projects of our show, is to say that how do we then become critical of the ways that we, even as like quote unquote radical revolutionary Marxists, blah, 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 like are also we can be very deeply socialized and like non-critical of how capitalism still structures like our desires and what our visions of the future could be.
Yeah, I actually think maybe fully automated luxury communism is trying to do what we've said multiple times here, like trying to tackle capitalism on the plane of the real.
I actually think that's a great connection to make. I think you're absolutely right about that.
But moving on to chapter 6, the final chapter, the extermination of the name of God. Honestly, this was the chapter that I found least interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It did have some, I think if you are someone too that has read poems that he references, it'd probably be good to read those to get the true appreciation of what's going on here. I think the big idea, and you see this whenever the general opinions in society, or like if you ask anybody about poetry, it's always, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean? Anticipating like that there has to be, because of capitalist exchange, like there has to be like this, what's the word? The equivalent, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be an equivalent real that this poem is ultimately referencing.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that's the biggest thing you can think about in terms of the final chapter. What poetry does is if it like brings to fore very quickly like that contradiction that words or signifiers must refer to something real.
Yeah, it's almost like this like romantic idea of what poetry is.
In that sense, that's how poetry is sort of a threat. Poetry is kind of like, in a sense, it is that almost like a gift, because there is no exchange with the real. It's its own thing. I don't know how to kind of square that one either, but I think you see that reaction whenever people encounter poetry, like that there has to be an exchange. You know what I mean? There has to be that equivalence.
Yeah.
In poetics, that is very frustrating to people that try to understand poetry or talk about poetry. The quotes that I pulled from that chapter are absolutely some of my favorites, like this one. The model of a symbolic exchange also exists within the field of language, something like the core of political anti-economy, a site of extermination of value and the law, which would be poetic language, which is kind of exactly what I was just trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see that, maybe that's like an actual place where you could see this kind of symbolic exchange actually being present. And it would make sense for Baudrillard that it has to come in some form of language, right? But it's just like a poetics and not necessarily, again, like a language based on like referent to like commodities and brands and sort of like that kind of idea of like a capitalist sort of structured language.
I love the first sentence here in this paragraph. The poetic is the insurrection of language against its own laws. That's so fantastic. And he talks about how Saussure never formulated that subversive consequence. Others, however, have accurately assessed the danger inherent in the simple formation of another possible formulation of language. That's why they have all made to conceal this in accordance with their code, calculating the signifier as a term and signified as a value. So applying that capitalist exchange logic to language itself in the context of like structural linguistics in particular.
This is like pure Baudrillard. One of the things that he pissed a lot of people off about was when he said the Gulf War never took place, because it basically is saying that even the way that the people who were involved in that conflict understood it was so thoroughly mediated by like media and news broadcasts. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Rick Roderick, but Rick Roderick is still one of my philosophical heroes, and he has a great lecture. It's like 30 minutes from the Great Courses series on Baudrillard, and he has a story where he was like, he remembers Baudrillard saying this and reading this and just been like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? And then he actually met a vet who was in the Gulf War, and he was talking to her and was like, hey, like, so tell me about your experience. And she even said, like, I had to watch the news reports to understand what was happening in the war that I was fighting, precisely because it was so fractured and dismembered, and the ability to understand it holistically was so thoroughly removed from my position, even involved in the conflict, that it was only through the mediation of news and the symbolic that I could actually, like through the mediation of the simulation, that I could actually understand what was going on. And to me, that was always just like a really powerful way to describe exactly what Baudrillard was saying. Like, he has this way of just saying, like, oh, this thing you think exists, it actually doesn't exist. And this whole last block quote is just like him saying this over and over again, which I really love.
Baudrillard wrote a wonderful piece about the Gulf War. The name of the piece was "The Enemy Has Disappeared." And now, I don't want you to think that I believe what I'm about to say is my own position. I'm just giving you Baudrillard's. Because I don't think the Gulf War was planned as deeply as he does in the regards that he thought it was. Baudrillard was offered a job by a French newspaper to cover the war. So, of course, he agreed on condition he not go to the Gulf because he wanted to cover it on CNN where it would really happen. Follow me? I mean, the war would really, who won or lost would be told to us on CNN. We won't know who won or lost anywhere else, so to cover the war in the sense of hyperreality, the way to cover it is sitting in one's flat in Paris on CNN. That's how he covered the war. His thesis runs as such. He took the Gulf War very seriously. Baudrillard states that war is real if anything is. I think that's a powerful quote. If anything is real, war is. It sounds pessimistic, but if there's something we could still attach reality and meaning to it, if it's not war, one would wonder what it was. Because it is just an incredible human event filled with passion, pain, suffering, madness, and all that. If it's not real, what is? If anything at all would be, it would be war. According to Baudrillard's reading of the war, America, as for Baudrillard, the leading society culturally in the world, the one that leads the cultural trajectory of the world through television, movies, and so on. The war that we fought in the Gulf was not directed against the enemy. As it turned out, the enemy was left not much different than we found them. It was not directed against any enemy at all. The enemy disappeared in the show business. The war was directed against reality. The war was to show us that even war isn't real. The war was to kill the Vietnam syndrome, a war that we remember as real, as a real war.
So he does... I do want to bring up this because he articulates this a little bit better than I do, but I was talking about how that there's that capitalistic, or the, like, whenever we're encountering poetry, like, we're expecting this equivalence. He says linguistics opposes the discursive order, equivalence and accumulation, to the literal order of reversibility and dissemination. Backing up, everywhere there is the same attempt to reduce the poetic to a meaning, a wanting to say, to bring it back under the shadow of meaning, to shatter the utopia of language and bring it back to the topic of discourse. So that wanting to say, like, everyone is the same, to reducing the poetic to, I want to say so. The poet is trying to communicate X through signifiers and equivalents and so forth. But that idea of this is that poetry really is breaking down that relationship, unmasking it, exposing the scission between what we view as the real and the actual function of the sign itself in the linguistic system.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, because I guess I read that as saying not that a language in which there is only just a full understanding and like embed and like almost like valorization of just the symbols like mediating amongst themselves. Like, I mean, this is a hard thing to parse here, because it's almost as if like what Baudrillard is saying is that poetics, what it does isn't necessarily like the model of how language should be, but it's a model in the sense that it shows the sort of break between the signifier and the signified, how like this idea that there is this concrete thing that the signifiers are referencing is in fact, that is the illusion. Like, that is the thing that has to be broken. And like, that's why the idea of like people being frustrated with poetry, saying that, oh, the poet is trying to describe X with these signifiers, is in itself like the sort of the ideological break that has to happen.
That very function is what capitalism tries to obscure, right? Because it's trying to say that these systems of equivalence have an actual equivalence to something real, rather than just being part of this internalized system itself.
Yeah, which in the simulation, right? That's the whole thing about, just as I'm going to keep doing this, just out of spite to Baudrillard. It's like, but that's the whole thing with the Matrix, right? Is like, you don't realize you're in the Matrix. Like, that's the whole point. It's like to say, like, you still think that this is all referencing like something real, but the truly radical Baudrillard thing is like, there is no like desert of the real that it's actually referencing. It's like, there is just the matrix. Like that's the real radicality that you have to get to.
I think it's interesting too, like in the context of fiat currency, right? Because that I think is a good way to think about it too, is the currency, in particular now that it's been decoupled from like something like the gold standard or like a real, right, is totally on its own symbolic logic beyond that, right? There's no real value that our money represents anymore. It's totally made up and simulated.
Yeah, and
arbitrary.
It's really all just about like how you control the actual supply of these like hollow signifiers and like how many of them there are and like how we sort of understand what their value is based on like the larger system and like totality of the sort of process of circulation of, or like the velocity of how they're being exchanged.
Should I read this last quote? I think it is fantastic.
Yeah, drop it, because that's the one that I was reading and wanted to bring up the Gulf War example as a reference to.
Virtually and literally speaking, there has never been a linguistic subject. It is not even true of we who speak that we purely and simply reflect the code of linguistics. Likewise, there has never been an economic subject, a Homo Economicus. This fiction has never been inscribed anywhere other than in a code. There has never been a subject of consciousness, and there has never been a subject of the unconscious. In the simplest practice, there is always something that cuts across these simulation models, which are all rational models. There has always been a radicality absent from every code, every objective rationalization that has basically only ever given rise to a single great subject, the subject of knowledge, whose form is shattered from today, from now, by undivided speech.
Yeah, and then, of course, big shots fired here. Basically, we have all known this for much longer than Descartes, Husserl, Marx, and Freud.
Rat-a-tat-tat.
Yeah. Yeah. Brah, brah. Well, Cooper, do you want to do some wrap up here? I know that was kind of the end of the notes, and this is wow, this has been a journey, a real journey.
Oh, man, seriously. We can kind of close up and I think just recapitulate some of the big points, the highlights here. One of the most important, I think, is that transition. And I think it's, you can maybe even map it onto like the neoliberal turn, but perhaps it's even earlier in the advent of the mass media, but that rise of consumption replacing production as kind of the dominant material force over society is something to consider. Sort of the potential for some type of symbolic exchange to be a potential site of resistance or revolution itself are things to consider. Relevance for today, I think those kind of go to that. I mean, looking back at this, you can just sort of see and be impressed with how accurate a majority of what Baudrillard, the picture that he draws for us, is. I mean, it's incredibly prophetic. And I think even if, there is no practical application or way to use symbolic exchange to bring about the end of capitalism directly, I mean, I think it helps to at least gain an understanding for the situation that we find ourselves in today, and really come to grips with the challenge that we face. And anyone that is interested in being a revolutionary, there's some things to consider here. I don't think you can fully just write off Baudrillard as an old provocateur and just trying to get a rise out of people. I think there is something he is absolutely tapped into, and his understanding and ability to foresee how current trends and when he was living would play themselves out now is pretty remarkable. I think you have to hand it to him there.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. In some ways, this is something that I've been saying more and more lately across a lot of different shows, that to me, if we want to be anti-capitalist, we better understand what the fuck it is that capitalism is that we're opposing, and how it works and how it functions and how it has developed historically to get to the place where it is now. And to me, reading Baudrillard is really crucial, because Baudrillard, I think, was incredibly prescient and still one of the most powerful critics of the function of the sign and like simulation and consumer society and media and image, and how all these things have thoroughly just like embedded themselves in capital as a like necessary part of its functioning. But as you said too, like the way it shapes desire and subjectivity and all this stuff. You know, it's funny, whenever I think about Marx, you know, and I always think about what did I really respect the most about Marx, it was that Marx, whenever he would critique something, he would understand that thing better than the person he was even critiquing, and could really flesh out its implications and its weaknesses in a way that, you know, was ruthless, and he could be a complete dick about it sometimes. But, you know, there was a way that even the things he most vehemently disagreed with, he really, really like engaged with those in a deep, serious way to understand them. And so, you know, to me, it's like, agree with Baudrillard or disagree with him, I honestly don't give a shit. But like, at the very least, you know, this is a really powerful, radical critique that demands, I think, engagement with it if you care about, yeah, like being anti-capitalist or revolutionary radical, whatever that means for you. It's been a while since I've read Baudrillard, but this has actually been a good reminder for me of like, oh yeah, like this is why this is so important. And it's also making me realize how much I'm still deeply influenced by Baudrillard, even if I haven't, you know, been at that anarchist bookstore reading it with the guy who owns the wolf in a long time. It's like, but this was still really formative for me, and I think it's helped me remember that in a way that I just normally don't think about.
Yeah, it's and like I said at the beginning, I think it's a good way to help concretize, or like give you a good way to understand even Marx's like political economy, or like the vocabulary as applied to things like fashion and life and death, and sort of how those relationships work. I don't know, for me it's a little bit easier than like how many bobbins or like whatever obscure like thing that Marx is referring to in Capital. What's the other one? I can't. Alicots and shit. Yeah.
I mean, well, you know, I'm not going to begrudge anyone if they're like, yeah, I don't really give a shit about reading any of that. Give me fashion, give me life and death. And I'm just like, I respect that, you know, mad respect. Cooper, do you want to plug your things one last time before we get on out of here?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can, my podcast is Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. Very much, I think we talk a lot about anarchism. We talk a lot about post-structuralism, really philosophy in general, art, culture, society. I mean, it's kind of like my show I put on the show that I kind of want to do, the people that I want to talk to. And, you know, I oftentimes do get some pretty good guests. I have had Todd McGowan. I've had Todd May, I've had Andrew Culp, the economist James Galbraith. So I've had like some real legitimate guests, including Adam as well.
Yeah,
we did an episode. So just search, you know, Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour at any place that you find podcasts, and you'll see it. But you can also, if you do enjoy the show and you feel so inclined, would definitely appreciate donating, you know, maybe $1 a month to the Patreon, which is at patreon.com/MUHH. You can keep up with the podcast Twitter feed at UnconsciousHH, as well as the Instagram feed at UnconsciousHH. That is it, man.
Do all that shit right now. It's my Stalinist injunction. It's my authoritative demand, the demand of the big other. Go do all those things. Well, Cooper, I will just say, I know I didn't get to call you this, but just so you know, if you've listened to the show, everyone is Comrade, so you're Comrade Cooper. Triple C, that's what I'm going to call you.
Yeah, right.
I guess this is your first time on Red Library, but by no means will it be your last. So you and I, I'm sure, will discuss some other things to do in the future together, maybe in the same Venn diagram between Lacanian psychoanalysis, Baudrillard, Deleuze, Guattari. Maybe some Guattari would be really fun to do at some point.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
I am doing that big series, so like I'm right now in the middle of tackling Machinic Unconscious.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And so I think we're on chapter 4. Next one will be, or we've gone the first 4 chapters. We'll be doing the 5th one in a couple of weeks. And I think we're going to continue on, like, just 2 guys that I'm podcasting with throughout, I think, Guattari's solo work. But we also do reference like 1,000 Plateaus significantly as well. So definitely check that out too.
Yeah. And your show is one of the ones I have at the top of my podcast queue every week. So definitely a big heart energy from me. Big recommend for Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. And I guess we're out of here. We're going to shut down the podcast factory machines. We're going to put up our PPEs. We're all going to go home today. We've made enough podcasts. So Cooper, thanks a ton for being on the show, Triple C, and we'll have you back here soon. And peace out to all you Comrade listeners across the globe.
Thanks for having me. And let's see, super egoic injunction is to enjoy the podcast.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Turn on your desiring machines. Enjoy the podcast. All right. We'll catch y'all later. Peace.
Peace.
All right. That's my Matthew McConaughey. What do you think? I don't know why. Was feeling some Matthew McConaughey energy right now after Jean Baudrillard. It's an odd pairing, an odd relationship to put those two symbolically in exchange with each other. I don't even know if that makes sense. Whatever, we're going with it. Big shout out to Triple C for coming in the library for the first time, really doing a lot of excellent hard work and prep for this really, really complex book, but one I hope is going to really add a lot to your thinking about the relationship between production, media, the image, the symbolic, excrement, death, chaos magic, and all that other good stuff in your ways of theorizing and critically reflecting on the nature of capitalism today as we find it. And I also want to give Triple C a big shout out for helping me to just re-tap into my love of Baudrillard and to really remember why he has been such a big influence on me. So Triple C, thanks comrade. We're going to see you back here next week, same time, same place in the library for more theoretical goodness, more critical, analytical, icy/spicy hot takes and analysis as always. And until then, remember to do what you always do and what we always are giving you the injunction to do. Keep thinking, keep reading, keep reflecting, keep dreaming, keep hoping, keep searching for those lost futures, because that's what we're doing here. And we need all the help that we can get. We got to do it together. Remember, we out here. We'll see you next time, comrades. Red Library out. Peace.